Hello, everybody. So, before we get into the electrical impulses and functioning of your heart, we need to understand how your muscle cells and that sort of thing function when they get these electrical impulses and how this all sort of works together to make your heart pump. Right? So, heart objective number 8 is compare and contrast the structural and functional properties of cardiac and skeletal muscles. Right? If you guys remember correctly, you had a few different types of muscle from ANP1. You had cardiac muscle fibers, smooth muscle, which are your organs like your intestines, and then your skeletal muscles, which you have more control over and that sort of thing. Right? So cardiac muscles and muscle fibers are a little bit different than your other skeletal muscles, right? So when we start talking about your cardiac muscle, remember that is the entire myocardial layer of your heart. So we're going to be looking at a few different pictures of these muscle fibers and that sort of thing. And if we look at them under a microscope, right, you can tell that they look stringier, right? They look way stringier than skeletal muscle fibers, right? Skeletal muscle fibers look more accordioned. Cardiac look more stringy, for lack of a better term, right? The reason for this is because cardiac muscle cells are striated. They tend to be striated, so they have little striations or stripes on all of them if you're looking at this drawing of the cells, right? But they are shorter and tend to be a little bit fat, so if you notice how these guys are shorter and slightly pudgy, other than these little arms that outreach here. But they are branched. It's not one long tube like your skeletal muscle is. They branch off so they can connect to different muscles or muscle fibers around them. Right? And because of that, they are all interconnected. You want your cardiac muscle fibers to be interconnected, right? So your descriptions for cardiac muscle they are striated muscles, they are short, fat, branched, and they are interconnected because of all of that, right? Your connective tissue within this matrix connects to the fibrous skeleton. Right? If we're going to get down on a microscopic level of this, especially if you had Dr. Stokes for your ANP1 instructor, because he went into greater detail with some of this, your cardiac muscle fibers have more T-tubules in them. They are wider, they have less T-tubules in them, but the T-tubules within your cardiac muscle are wider, and because of that, the inner workings of the cell, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, is way more simple than that in skeletal muscle fibers, right? All of that compounds to help your cardiac muscle fibers do the job that they need to do, right, which is continuously beat. Because of that, they need more calcium because they are constantly pumping, right? If you remember from ANP1, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or SR, within the cells is what stores calcium and then gives that calcium to the T-tubules. So cardiac muscle has more of a calcium storage than your regular skeletal muscle because they are constantly pumping even when you're asleep. And there are less T-tubules to share that calcium amongst within them, right? However, if you're looking at these muscles these muscle drawings compared to your cardiac ones, you see the nucleus, you can see the little nucleus. Unsurprisingly, right? Unsurprisingly, your cardiac muscles are actually going to need more mitochondria, right? More mitochondria, more energy. They're going to have numerous large mitochondria those mitochondria are going to take up 25 to 35% of cell volume so that your heart has the energy it needs to be able to pump. And all of these interconnections here are created by something called intercalated discs, which means they are junctions between cell anchors, right, and within your cardiac cells. You have something called a desmosome, right, which prevent the two intercalated discs from separating during contraction. And then you have more gap junctions that allow ions to pass through, which electrically couple together adjacent cells. So all of these cells basically, the difference is way oversimplified between your cardiac muscle fibers here and your skeletal muscle fibers is your cardiac muscles have a better energy source stored within them because your heart has to beat even when you're asleep. Remember, your skeletal muscles are the muscles that you control, like your legs and your arms and that sort of thing, whereas your cardiac muscle, you don't, right? You don't have to think about that. Your heart just beats, including when you're asleep. So your cardiac muscle is built more for energy efficiency and for energy storage, so it has that energy to continuously pump. And your heart muscle fibers and cells are more interconnected with these intercalated discs so that they can work together better instead of your skeletal muscle fibers. In fact, they work together so well that you can actually take the muscle fiber of the heart and sort of unwind it. Instead of it being multiple muscles layered on top of each other, like your quads are, if you remember your quadrupeds, which are the muscles of your upper leg, are multiple muscles layered on top of one another to get the job done. Your cardiac muscles are found in bundles that are all strung together so they can be unwound and work together for when your heart beats. This means that all of these muscle fiber bundles within your heart work together in something called a functional synctum, or a singular unit. So your heart muscle tissue and muscle fiber, when your heart gets the signals to beat, is going to work together and all at the same time to create the contractions. That way you don't end up with things misfiring and you only have one out of the 4 chambers contracting at a time or something messed up like that. All of these muscle fibers, because the cells are the cells are connected with one another through those intercalated discs, and everything is wound together in muscle bundles. Your heart is interconnected. The muscles are interconnected within it itself, and they act as a functional synctum to all beat simultaneously at the same time to keep your heart pumping the way it is supposed to beat. Right? Which brings us to the chemistry behind muscle cell contraction, right? I am not going to stress this sort of thing very much, but we are going to go over it. So, heart objective number 9 is to describe in detail the events of cardiac muscle cell contraction, right? There are 3 phases to this. You're not normally going to hear about the second phase, but the words you're going to hear most often are phase 1 and 3. Your first phase is called depolarization. The second phase is called the plateau phase. And the third phase is called repolarization. Right? During depolarization, there has been a sodium influx to the heart. Right? And your heart has fast voltage-gated sodium channels inside these cells. Right? That creates a positive feedback cycle that rapidly opens up many more sodium channels, which ups the membrane potential of these cells. When there's no more sodium to pass through, that channel inactivation ends this phase. During the plateau phase, you have calcium influxing through and flowing through calcium channels within your muscle cells. If you guys remember back to ANP1, most of the cells within our body work on something called a sodium-potassium pump, where sodium is being traded through the cell membrane with potassium to trade things back and forth. But your muscle cells did not fire off until you had some calcium in there as like a key to create a gap junction and make things go, right? So during this plateau phase of your heart, you now have the sodium, because that was the depolarization phase. The sodium has already come into this. So now you have calcium involved, and calcium is rushing through these calcium channels. Because the potassium channels are starting to open, and calcium is keeping things depolarized, basically. But during your third phase of repolarization, the calcium channels close up and go inactive, and the potassium channels are opened, meaning all of the potassium that needed to trade with the sodium from the first phase is now rushing out. That allows a potassium influx, which then brings the membrane potential back to its resting voltage, because as things are like rushing out of the cell, voltage is reset, and all the ions need to rebalance. This is how your muscle fibers twitch, or your cardiac muscle fibers twitch, and how things are going. When things are depolarizing, sodium is rushing in. When things are repolarizing, it's trading the potassium for the sodium, getting rid of the potassium, right? And then during the plateau phase, you have calcium coming in to try and even things out and help with the sodium, right? And that is how your muscle fibers are going to continuously function. So you need a little bit of calcium, just like you did for your other cells, to work. Most of this is going to work on that sodium-potassium pump that you guys know so much about already, from ANP1. And potassium is needed so that things can repolarize and that voltage level resets at its base level. Yeah, so a little bit of potassium can go a long way. This is why, because all of these pumps start with sodium influxes, why heart patients have to watch their sodium intake. Because sodium, as we know from our other units about blood, can also increase your blood pressure. So sodium in and of itself can mess with your heart rate and mess with your blood pressure. So it is something that very much needs to be watched if you are talking about cardiac patients, right? Your next video, we're going to discuss the electrical impulses that actually make your blood flow, or that cause your heart to beat. And we'll talk about how we can read those, or EKGs. Right? Have a wonderful day.